Hey, welcome to this event that is sponsored by Milites Christi, suicide in the military and the church and its role and responsibility. I'd like to introduce, first of all, the leadership of Milites Christi so you can meet them. And if you'd introduce yourselves, please.
I'm already standing. I'm Todd Lovell. I'm a third-year MDiv. I'm Rob Kinghorn, second-year MDiv, Navy veteran and former frontline journalist.
Here's Alexis Arswaga, third-year MDiv, Marine veteran.
Let's open with a word of prayer. O Lord, give us strength to speak life into the unkind silence that is born of hardness of heart. The unkind silence that clouds the serenity of understanding and is the enemy of peace. Give us strength to be the first to offer the healing word and the renewal of friendship, that the bonds of goodwill and love may be strengthened for the good of humankind and to further your eternal loving purpose. Through Jesus Christ our Lord we pray. Amen. My name's Matt Floating, Director of Ministerial Formation and Field Education. There is a sheet circulating to indicate that you would like to be in touch with Milites Christi and their events, or would like to receive ministerial formation credit for participating if you're a Divinity Fellow, Thriving Rural Community Fellow, or Academic Year Field Education person. My particular connection to this topic is that I served as an Army National Guard chaplain. And so I'm more in tune with the National Guard's sort of experience, or the reservist experience that gets called up out of their community. And it's sort of like this. You wear your civilian uniform, you take it off, you put on your military uniform, and then you deploy. And you're gone 3 months to a year. You come back to your community, and maybe this happens several times. You take off the military uniform. You shed that identity, but you cannot shed the experiences that you've had in the field. They're with you, even as you put back on your civilian uniform. 2 million service persons have been in Iraq and Afghanistan from America alone. For every service person killed, 25 commit suicide. And for those of you who are here because of general interest as a pastor, maybe you heard the report released by the World Health Organization last week that among persons aged 45 to 64, 800,000 persons commit suicide every year. That's one person every 40 seconds. So if you're interested, a tool that I use in counseling, a no-harm contract, it includes a Durham crisis line where they will come to your home in an unmarked car and do an intervention, is right here, and you're welcome to pick up one afterwards. Well, let me introduce our real experts, our panelists here today. So at the end of the table, Professor Dr. Warren Kinghorn has a dual appointment at the medical school and here at the Divinity School in theology and psychiatry. The Reverend Dr. Amy Laura Hall, who is a United Methodist elder in theological ethics. Reverend Dr. John Oliver is the head of chaplain services at the VA hospital here in Durham. And the Reverend Heather Rodriguez is chief of staff and pastor at Duke Memorial United Methodist Church. Dr. Kinghorn, if you would begin, and each of the panelists can introduce themselves and their connection with this topic.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me? My mic. My name is Warren Kinghorn. I know many of you. I have the privilege to teach here as well as to serve as a psychiatrist at the Durham VA Medical Center across the street, where I'm colleagues with John. I also want to acknowledge Gary Kuna and Ryan Higgins. So if you guys could stand. They are on the suicide prevention team of the Durham VA. So if anyone has specific questions about our local services here in Durham, they're wonderful, excellent resources. I was a divinity student 13 years ago today here on September 11, 2001. And unlike today, in light New York, it was a quite beautiful, crisp, cool fall day. I had just finished an Old Testament class with Stephen Chapman, and he announced that the World Trade Centers had been hit, and walked over to the Bryan Center and watched the towers fall, and then walked back into York Chapel, which is now the York Room, for a Christian ethics class with Stanley Hauerwas, and he very soberly warned that we were in for a long period of war, and he was right. And so the fact that we're sitting here now 13 years later, marking a war that's still underway that essentially began that day in Afghanistan and others as well, with really no end in sight given the President's speech last night, it's with sadness that we also mark this event that's also dedicated to Suicide Prevention Week, marking military suicide. And I think the most basic point I want to acknowledge is that military suicide, like all suicide, is a personal and family and human tragedy. It's not just kind of a social concept. It's easy for people like me to take the statistics on military suicide and to make political or moral points. But before any of that, suicide has to do with deeply personal experiences. A couple of points, and then we can come back into Q&A. We know that the military suicide rate roughly doubled between 2004 and 2009. We know that for the first time in decades, it exceeded the suicide rate in the general population, where it remains. We also know that in recent years, more service members have died by suicide than by enemy fire in the context of deployment. But there's a lot that we don't know about military suicide and veteran suicide. People often assume that this increase in suicide has to do primarily with what happens in deployment, in combat. And there is certainly some truth to that. People who are deployed over and over and over again seem to be at some increased risk. And killing in war, for example, is associated with increasing thoughts of suicide. But in the larger studies that have been done, it's clear also that deployment actually is not the only factor, maybe not even the major factor in the increased risk of suicide in military personnel. What we find is that if you look at it, the presence of mental disorders overall is highly associated with suicide attempts, and that many of the people who do attempt suicide or complete suicide have never been deployed. And this, I think, also has to do not just with what happens in deployment, but with the cumulative stress in a military which is experiencing now 13 years of war, and that's ebbed and flowed over the years, but that's still the case. So it's not just what happens in the context of combat, but it's what happens in the context of training and return and back and forth and separation from family and everything else. So here's, I think, the only maybe political point I want to make is that when we think about military suicide, we need to think not just about preventing war or getting people out of combat, but also about the context of who we as a culture send to war to begin with, who we ask to go to war for us when we do go to war. Because we know, for example, in a very recent study, that people with a history, people who with enlisted military service in the all-volunteer Army era, military era, since the draft ended, have about twice the risk of childhood sexual abuse as people who, as was the case, as the general population. And that's new in the all-volunteer era as opposed to the draft era, which kind of fits with the idea that, and this is not a generalizable point, but it fits with the idea that if we build a military based on recruitment that focuses on opportunities for education and for economic mobility, that that military service is going to appeal to people that are in really difficult kinds of situations, family situations and economic situations and other things. And so if that's who we ask to go to war, and then you take people who again, not everyone by any means, but you take people who on average are maybe at maybe higher risk because of prior trauma, and you put people in difficult combat situations, and there's this kind of hyper-masculine ethic of the military culture in which the confession of vulnerability is not encouraged, then all those things together, it makes sense that there might be an increase in risk, at least, for thinking of suicide or for completed suicides. The only other point I want to make, though, is that we're not military policymakers, at least most of us are not. We're thinking about the church. So what can the church do? And I'd suggest that we need to just think very practically. And I'll say this just in bulleted form. We can come back later. One is walk with veterans without attempting to overlay their narrative with our own or your own or what we expect of them. That includes also walking with them without smothering them with valorization, with calling them heroes and other things. Let veterans self-define, and let veterans have the time and the space and the ability to process in relationship, and tell veterans that you're going to keep walking with them. There's no expectation for how people define themselves or to jump too quickly into social roles. And you can hope for veterans who are really struggling. Not all veterans are struggling at all, but some are. You can hope for veterans who are struggling and convey that we're going to do the work of hoping for you right now. To the veteran who's depressed or who's abusing alcohol or other things, that hope might be hard to come by in certain cases, but the church can help do the work of hoping. The church can connect veterans with resources at the VA or in other settings. Resources not only for addressing mental health concerns, but also for housing and employment. We can talk more about that. And I think the church has a responsibility to put veterans to work. And I don't just mean like to hire vets, in paying positions in which people can support themselves, although that's important, but also to find active roles for returning vets within the church. So vets have a lot to offer, as those of you that are veterans know very well, and have gifts that need to be used and need to be called on to exercise those gifts. So churches ought to be finding ways to do that, and that has to be done in a very individual way.
So I think we're just supposed to briefly explain why we are on this panel. I think I'm on this panel because I've taught here for 15 years, and I've taught many military chaplains, folks who are currently in the military, also veterans, and in my church I've served as a Sunday school teacher to many World War II veterans, and I served on the ethics board of the VA Center 14 years ago, and at the time they were already talking about the ways that the VA centers across the country were being underfunded and overstressed. It was already on everybody's radar there, even though it's only come on the radar evidently recently for many people in the civilian population.
I'm John Oliver. I'm the Chief of Chaplain Service at the Durham VA Medical Center. I also trained here at Duke University Medical Center as a CPE, Clinical Pastoral Education Supervisor, and have been at the Durham VA for about 17 years. Briefly, I'm also coming off, and I think this is why I was invited to be here today, I'm coming off a 5-year grant where I traveled around the country training rural clergy on the importance of understanding their potential role in supporting veterans and their families as our veterans have come home. I have more to say about that if you're interested.
I am not here today because of what I have done or what I know. I'm here today because of what I do not know and what I have not done. My name is Heather, and I am pastor at Duke Memorial. I've been there a total of 8 weeks. And grew up in the Mennonite tradition. So grew up in a pacifist world that did not then interact with anyone who was actively a soldier or a veteran, and kind of in that growing up, used that as my excuse to not reach out to and do ministry with those who were involved in the military or those who were coming out of service. And I think the reason why I'm here today, alongside of being very confessional to you about the places we have not gone as pastors and as a church, is also a brief story about an experience I had in April small group, we had stepped out to do a scary thing. It was scary to me, which was stand in front of a public store in Raleigh and hold up a sign that said free prayer. And I walked away from that hour kind of surprised at who God had brought to me in that experience. And one of the men who engaged me that day was a veteran. I didn't know that because he came up to me and let me pray with him. I knew that because he yelled at me from about 20 feet away, "Where was your God when I was in Iraq?" And as he continued to walk away, I didn't run after him, but I yelled back, "Can we talk?" And he turned and said, "I left with 4 buddies and I came home alone. What kind of God is that? I don't want to talk." And I knew instantly that that was a form of praying, right? That we were praying together as we were yelling across the parking lot. And it was very interesting that 10 minutes later, an employee of that store came over to me and apologized on behalf of this veteran, had overheard this interchange of shouting and cussing. And my immediate reaction was to say, no, 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 that was prayer. That was prayer. And immediately I was struck with this God push in my heart to look at how I am pastoring veterans, or more importantly, how I am not pastoring veterans. And so I'm here today confessionally to learn and to grow and to invite you along for that journey as well.
We're going to have a space for questions from you all, so you can be preparing yours, but we're going to start with one that I'd like each of the panelists to respond to. Secretary of Defense Chuck Hagel this past week said in a statement that as families and friends of service members, and as the military, we need to stop judging those who ask for help, to not stigmatize or avoid them. And that's what he's pointing to as a big reason that people in uniform are killing themselves. So I'm wondering if each of you would respond to Chuck Hagel's statement, and have you seen it? And what does it look like in your context?
Order you want us to go in?
You're ready, Amy.
Okay, so what I did in preparation for this was I contacted 5 different former students, colleagues who are either in the military currently or have been, people I respect very much, and asked what their response would be. And I got long responses. I also received their explicit permission to share with you what they said, which I think is important. And so I'm going to read to you excerpts from what they sent back to me. While any suicide is a tragedy, I'm not convinced that there is a real escalation in numbers, but rather a better system for tracking them. I mean that there were likely as many in the aftermath of World War II and Vietnam, but we just didn't realize or track it. From someone else. Within the military, there is a stigmatism among service members to seek help as flags go on records, which could block desired assignments or promotions. In addition, there is a supply-demand issue. For example, say you are a soldier stationed at Fort Bragg and desire to see a counselor. Wait time for an on-post appointment, initial appointment, can be less than 2 weeks, but that follow-on appointment may take months. Referrals off-post through TRICARE could take longer. Maybe you can explain what she means on that. And the desired provider a soldier wants to see may cost out of pocket. The medical system is improving but not keeping up with the demand. From another. I think another important point here is that soldiers are told over and over that what they are doing is not wrong. Obviously, that term wrong is a complicated issue that has many diverse implications for individual soldiers, but we should keep in mind that for those who do experience moral injury and PTSD and other related conditions, it can be hard to square that experience with the experience of doing one's duty or defending the country. The gap between the language of noble purpose and the reality of what happens in war is large, but the dominant narrative is that the action of the soldier is noble and for a good purpose. So when the soldier begins to feel psychological trauma, there is a state of confusion that exists between what was done in war and what the soldier is told is the reason for doing what was done. Another thing important to this conversation, he goes on, is that while the focus is mainly on veterans from Iraq and Afghanistan, this is a wider issue for all veterans. All this is to say, and I'm still quoting, that we need to not only be concerned about Iraq and Afghanistan vets, but all vets. The military does something to the human mind, and here, he's pretty graphic here. The first thing I was told in basic training by my drill sergeant was this: welcome to the U.S. Army. Your job now is to invade foreign countries, kill the men, rape the women, and sell the children into slavery. This is at a time when the nation is technically at peace that he's describing. So I think you can see the formative impact of such. So we need to help all vets overcome the stigma of what they are feeling. It has been almost 30 years since I was in the Army. I'm much better and have overcome PTSD and such, but only recently have I been able to talk about any of this very openly. One more. Shift from another respondent. Shift to the current situation of repeated deployments. We've been inundated with news reports about suicide, both active duty and veteran, increasing at an alarming rate. When I taught suicide prevention for leaders 2001 to 2004, I think he means 2014, the suicide rate in the Army was significantly less than in the civilian sector. Now both rates are essentially the same. I have not seen correlations of suicide to the number and duration of deployments, but I would not be surprised that people enduring repeated deployments are more at risk. Soldiers bond with each other while deployed. If I have been deployed for 3 of the first 5 years of my marriage, it is highly likely my marriage will suffer. I do not have the bond with my wife that I do with my unit, and she does not understand why. Increase this geometrically if unfaithfulness occurs, which is surprisingly frequent, he says. If I have been absent for most of my children's growing up years, I may not know them. You see the point. And depending on one's duties, it is highly likely that a person may have been involved in traumatic situations facing secondary PTSD. I've seen a lot, some that may border on the horrendous, but not like others have seen. Horrifying visions and situations overload a person's psyche forever. Another response. I know military veteran suicide has gone up in number over the last few years, but I also know that suicide in general has gone up. And I've read somewhere that the overall rate of increase is greater among non-military veterans than among military veterans. And he sent me an article that maybe we could look up and see if that's true, but he usually does his research. Middle-aged men, for example, are among the most successful suiciders, and veterans are no exception, except that vets tend to wait about 10 years longer before taking the plunge statistically. But suicide is a deeply personal thing, and I'd be loath to generalize about it. I've been close to 4 suicides. What they all had in common were that they were men.
Thank you. I'll be coming at this from a different angle. People are 5 times more likely to see their pastor than they are to see all other mental health care providers combined. That statistic scared me into thinking about how we as the CPE world and we as chaplains could begin to work with our colleagues in the field, particularly those that are in more rural areas, how we might explore ways to help them understand what they're seeing. Around the country, I would ask people to say, if they were pastors, have you had anybody that's been depressed? And if you're a pastor, I'd invite you to raise your hand. And same here. Let's see. Have you ever worked with anybody that's depressed? Have you ever worked with anybody with schizophrenia coming to your? What about homelessness? And perhaps that's not a mental health issue, but those all begin to border. On and on, I'd raise these issues, and pastors are consistently being faced with these challenges. My hope is that as you leave here, you'll understand the value of knowing some basic rudimentary responses and exploring how you yourself might respond when a crisis event occurs. I think clinical pastoral education is a phenomenal opportunity to explore how you will respond to individual cases. The other thing I'd like to just kind of from this deep place to my daughter, who is 13 years old, and she's got a real good sense of what the culture is like with the number of hours she spends on our iPod. But she describes things like this. She would look at someone and say, "You need professional help." stigmatizing the individual who might need professional help in such a way that she's just mocking or mimicking what is being said in our culture. We all believe that if someone needs professional help, then they're beyond normal. And so those are just some of the things that I've seen. I was interested to hear her response one day when we were driving down by where I received counseling, and I said, oh, by the way, that's where I received professional help, right there. And she was like, ooh, I don't want to know this. But the reason I tell you that story is because as pastors, when you normalize people's experience and you say, I can certainly understand why you might be having a tough time right now. If you've spent more time downrange with your buddies than you've spent with your spouse, then certainly you and your husband will not be having the same relationship you might have. I can certainly, if you as a pastor can understand that coming in, treating them as a subject rather than an object, another whole story. But if you're able to do that, and then perhaps even think about referring them to somebody, then they are much more likely to get the help if they know that you, their pastor, will, one, not stop being their pastor, but two, that you understand that there are times when we need help, when we all need support for different reasons. So just a quick statistic on that. In all of the work that I did for my doctoral work along the way, I found that pastors, when given an opportunity to think independently of referring someone to a mental health care provider, they responded with the other, writing in freehand, referring 0.08% of the time. In other words, with all of the questions asked, and if someone is displaying all of the different symptoms of post-traumatic stress, would you think of this? I wrote prayer, they could check that. Now maybe they were tired and didn't want to write anything, but only at 0.08% of the time did they independently think to refer out to a mental health care provider. So that's another thing we've been doing around the country, is helping our clergy understand ways they can begin a referral process. And that begins, frankly, with a conversation that I have with my social work friends and with my doctor friends, and they with me. We all go to the same church. I might say, hey, Warren, I need a referral on somebody. Who do you suggest? And then we can have this conversation online in appropriate ways. But I, as the pastor, can then make sure that Warren has a name I can give out, or at any rate, however you might do the referral process, when the parishioner hears the pastor agreeing with the reality that sometimes we do need support outside of the church and in our mental health, then this is a gift for them. Please remember, you will be the de facto mental health care provider, and that you need to understand that reality. And how will you do that? A couple other quick things I want to say. There's a great physician, Judith Herman. You probably know her work. Does a lot of work on trauma. She named 3 pathways, three things that we need to provide folks if we want to help them move through trauma. The first one she suggested was safety, that we need to provide individuals with safe spaces. Imagine a bus wreck on I-85, and by the way, we're not asking about if a tragedy will come to you as a pastor, we're talking about when a tragedy comes to you as a pastor, because they will come. So you have a wreck on I-85, can you create a safe place for children that were on the bus to make phone calls to their parents or whatever? You know, can you create safety? Psychological safety, all sorts of different types of safety. And by the way, I'm not sure, but I don't think there's a psychotropic drug for that just yet. We haven't created a medicine that will make you feel safe or actually create safety for you.
We're working on it.
They're working on it. The second thing that Judith Harmon suggests is that we need to remember, and pastors, this is our gift. We have a whole book of Lamentations that invites us to sincerely remember and lament and live in the pain, the complexity of that situation. So I strongly encourage our pastors to not move too quickly to the resurrection, but to live in the complexity of what comes before. And by the way, I don't think remembrance and lament are also things that our physicians can provide. Now, I will say we do have new cognitive behavioral therapies that are showing great promise, and we have great treatment programs, but we can't rely on one person to do this. We, as the community, can step in and support as well. The third thing she suggests is reconnection. And the value of reconnecting is immense. And Gary Kuhn and I go way back, but one of the main things I see in a lot of our, two main things I see in our suicides that I do roll-ups on, one of those is lack of community. People are transient, moving here and there, and don't have a solid community to which they belong. And that is one of the foundational pieces of successful transition through traumatic events, is having a community that supports you. And then also, in the other piece to that is, sadly, is pain medications and all those things, but we can talk about that at another time. But I do hope you'll understand that the church can provide safety, can promote lament and remembering, and can certainly help with reconnection. So I hope you as pastors will understand that when you leave here, while you didn't have a class on setting up a tea table for church after whatever, you probably aren't getting that in Div School. You're also probably not getting some of the other things that you need to do. And I strongly urge you to look into ways that you can get some of the education that you really will need when you get to the field. Thank you.
Yeah. And that's a powerful reminder for me sitting here. I actually did CPE when I was here at Duke Divinity, and it was one of the best decisions I made. And also the reminder, too, of referring out. I've never looked back and regretted referring someone out. At the same time, you know, what does it look like to do that in a way that says, this is getting really messy, I'm just going to move it out?
Right.
And how have we done that as a church in ways that are harmful to many groups of people, but today specifically veterans? The title of this forum, I noticed these words, shaping the silence. How do we shape the silence, and how do we not be silent? And what has our silence done? I heard a story just 2 weeks ago, secondhand, about a Methodist pastor in Fayetteville who last month was invited by one of his church members to go and visit her husband. She's coming, her children are coming to church, but the husband is not. And so this pastor went into this home excited to have this conversation, and this man said, "Thank you for being a church community for my wife and my children. Thank you for providing them a place to live into their faith. Thank you." Well, I can't be there, though, because of what I do. I work in the military. He couldn't reconcile those two. And I wonder how my silence, our silence, sometimes shapes this idea that we are not a place, not a community where we can have these conversations together and reconcile these things. I love the image, Matt, you gave us of taking off that suit coat and putting on that camouflage. Several of you were sharing with me recently that this idea of identity, you know, you leave and enter the military with your identity that's been shaped by home, by family, by school, by church, and when you come home, you've put on this new identity that is warrior identity. And so we do have resources, we do have liturgy, we do have worship experiences that can help a warrior take off that identity and put on Christ identity, put on Christ coat, right? And what we do in worship together. That identity that's found in baptism. So what would it look like? What does it look like for us to come back to that in our worshiping together, including those who are struggling with identity, to remind them in the baptismal vows they took, with a liturgy that puts off the old, the warrior, right? Renounces sin, reaffirms Christ's power over sin, gives a place for confession, repentance, forgiveness, lament, and then a place to move forward and find Christ's power in that. And it's messy. If any of you think that pastoral ministry is neat and tidy, I think I left here thinking that I was called to lead in ways that meant that I had all the answers and all the information. And in fact, it's about question asking and praying and struggling, and it is absolute messiness. And I will say, too, that is where we get a front row seat to what God can and does do in the brokenness and the messiness in regards to moving forward and healing. And that's exciting work, but it's also messy work.
Briefly, in terms of stigma, I've worked, for the last 7 years, I've worked at least a day a week in the emergency room of the Durham VA. And I've seen a lot of veterans presenting for the first time for mental health care. And I have to say, about 15% of veterans, especially younger veterans, who are coming for the first time for mental health care, and these are often in crisis situations, are brought by an older, usually male friend or mentor who's often a vet. So you might see a Vietnam vet who comes in and says, I've known him for 2 years now, and I'm a vet, and I've had PTSD for 30 years, and he isn't right, and you need to help him, and he's here. But the vet's there because somebody's put a hand on his shoulder and brought him in, usually him, sometimes her. And about 85% of people are brought in by a partner or a spouse or a fiancé or somebody in their family who has sometimes, at great personal cost, said, this is it. You have to get some help. And so people show up. But it's almost always through the encouragement or sometimes the pressure of others that people come into the emergency setting to seek help. Now, that's a selected population. So I see a lot of stigma, and it's in part just that it's really hard to step out and to say, I've been trying so hard to keep things going, and I just need to ask somebody else for help. And I would say that that's not limited to vets. It's the case with divinity school professors and divinity students and university students as well. And I just would invite you all and all of us that some of you in this room are thinking of suicide or have in the last several months. And don't ignore that, and don't just try to kind of power through that. Get help. It's okay. And if you're a student, you can go to CAPS. If you're a vet, come to the Durham VA, and we can talk more about resources for that. But I just encourage you not to ignore that, because it's so easy just to kind of push through, and then all of a sudden it catches up, and there's a crisis situation, and things feel really, really hopeless.
We want to turn our attention to questions that you brought with you, and we do have microphones, and our leadership can... Jin Ho, why don't you pose the first one for our panelists?
I work with PTSD folks through a hospice that provided a space for them to come and meet with the VA counseling. When I came here, I had a zeal and proud of how I served, and I was talking with one of our military Milites Christi, and somehow this school has silenced my military experience. And one of my friends used something. It's almost like a stigma. We're a plague that we served our country. I'm trying to figure out why I'm feeling this in Duke Divinity School. When I went, because I'm an immigrant who was proud of this country, who said, when people kept on telling me to, when I would have racial conflict, to go back to my country, the only way to silence them was for me to join the military. And now I'm being silenced of this here as a plague that I serve this country. And I'm trying to figure out why I'm feeling this. I'm going to lectures and this aura of professors who give this almost like, you guys are the nasty boys with the dunce hats that need to sit in the corner type of mentality. So I'm questioning those myself right now. And if you can somehow give me a light of what's going on here, because you said you were from the Mennonites who had this, and you are now in the UMC, and I don't know why. My friend really named it today for me, and I feel this a lot in the school.
So sadly, what you're feeling in this microcosm is what many of our veterans are feeling in their own microcosms after having served. I thank you for your willingness to serve. I don't know what you did, but it's important that you knew why you served and what you were about. So thank you for doing and being willing to do that. I would also say this is a place where a lot of ideas happen, and it's really important that we think very carefully about those ideas here. Pero yo vivo en el VA y allá hablamos español. Okay? Does that make sense? You have to translate that to the rest of the world. And it ain't translating sometimes, folks. So I hope you'll understand the value of really this beautiful language that you're learning, while you're understanding that sometimes eso no traduce, eso no vuela, and it just doesn't work elsewhere. So, thank you.
I would also say that, again, having taught here for 15 years, that many different students from all sorts of different walks of life find themselves alienated, alone, depressed here in this place. So I would just say I've had single moms say that they feel stigmatized. I've had survivors of domestic violence say that they feel silenced and don't have a place to go. Absolutely. Gay or lesbian students have found themselves silenced. I would just say that that this very large institution that is ostensibly Christian is a place where a lot of people feel alone, and they don't necessarily say that in class. You'll see a lot of bluster sometimes, especially in certain settings where people seem like they're very much at home and confident, but it's a place where a lot of students feel out of place and where their faith is tested at best, and sometimes where they leave here wondering what happened to their faith. So it's a very hard place to be.
Thank you, Jinho. I think we need to move to another question. Yeah. Somebody else?
My name is Will Clark. I'm a first-year MDiv student, and I'm also a chaplain candidate in the United States Army. One of the things that I've noticed, I was an enlisted soldier for 4 years in the Army National Guard. The Army tends to, or the military in general, tends to mass produce training for suicide prevention. So what do you think that leaders within the military can do to provide safe places to talk about this kind of issue for servicemen and women? Because there needs to be a place where they can talk about this stuff, not just on a one-on-one, because that doesn't work a lot of the time. You know, I was a chaplain assistant, and I had soldiers come to me on stuff, and I wasn't trained on it, and my chaplain was gone or wasn't in a position to talk to the soldier, so I was in the position where I had to lead as a young E4. So it's not easy. And so what are some things that y'all think regarding that?
Are you friends with any older military chaplains?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, because I can give you the name of somebody who, he wrote so much more than I was able to read about his experience over time, over years, decades, how things have shifted, because an admission of suicidality 20 years ago was mocked, and so there's an attempt to change a whole culture that is going to be very slow in coming, according to his estimation.
And I've seen that stigma, and that's why I was saying, what are some ways that we can create more safe places and more work that we can do?
Not go to war.
I think also, in terms of, I'm not obviously, I'm not a veteran myself and haven't served in the military, but two thoughts. One is just about military chaplaincy. As most of you know, military chaplains are absolutely the epicenter of these kinds of experiences, because chaplains alone have privilege of confidentiality. And so people can tell things to chaplains that can't tell anyone else. And you were in a hard position being a chaplain's assistant and not a chaplain, and yet being kind of thrust into that role. That's a really tough place to be. But one thing that I understand, at least is still the case with chaplaincy, is that chaplains do not have any redundancy, especially in deployment situations, so that a single chaplain bears the weight of that role in a way that's really unique to the military structure. Anybody else has somebody else who can step in, but chaplains don't. So it adds all sorts of pressure on the chaplains, who are also bearing really heavy weights of people coming in and talking about hard things. So one thing would be just thinking about how to expand and provide more community, I think, for military chaplains, especially in deployment situations. And the other thing which the military is also very aware of is having people look out for each other. So, some clear warning signs to look out for are drinking too much and in ways that are not healthy, people losing their temper in ways that are just clearly excessive or dangerous or violent, people not using guns well or taking risks with guns. Those are three things. And there's no way that the military, from the top down is going to be able to see all that. But individual people, are seeing that in their friends and buddies and others. So that's one way. And just really quickly, I honor your comment. And I can't speak for the institution, but I think that this kind of forum and the work that Milites Christi is doing is trying to address that. So thank you for making your comment earlier.
Cameron Schupach, third-year MDiv. You spoke of the stigma for the military of like this, talking about coming and getting help. As pastors, how can we do that as well when there's a stigma within this divinity school that you mentioned about going to see help for just mental health? I mean, how can we do it if we can't do it ourselves? How can we go out and help others?
Yes.
Yeah. According to a lot of folks at CAPS, there are a lot of divinity students who are partaking of mental health care, and I'm sure a lot of the faculty also are receiving professional help. And so the good news maybe is that more of you are seeking help than you might be telling one another. And I consider that to be good news. I would also just put in a little plug for, you mentioned cognitive behavioral therapy. That's much less expensive for institutions than actually doing the hard work of psychotherapy. That is more costly to institutions. And you said something that I didn't know in terms of the statistics of current military personnel being survivors of childhood sexual violence and abuse. Right? That's what you said. And if that's the case, then you're going to need both cognitive behavioral therapy and psychotherapy, and that's going to be more expensive for the VA system. And so let's just name that from my perspective, from what I have learned from people who are dealing with trauma response. Yeah.
So there's some forms of cognitive behavioral therapy that are targeted for trauma and for sexual trauma specifically, and there's some that are not. So there's different forms, and there's different models of, CBT is one form of psychotherapy, and then other more insight-oriented or psychodynamic approaches take longer and are more expensive, and that's a question I think that anybody who seeks care and goes in to see a therapist for the first time, the first session is always just about, is this a good fit? Is this? And there's no risk in that. You can go and see somebody, and if it doesn't seem like a good fit, that's fine. Move on to somebody else. But there's always a kind of sense of like, what's the right match between what people have to offer. Same way with CAPS. You can go to see CAPS, and if it doesn't fit, then move on to something else.
Well, but what I'm saying is a larger systemic question, because as pastors, you're also called, I think, to be ethicists. And I taught an ethics class that Heather was in that was pretty messy. I would say you probably didn't leave that class with clear answers. In terms of the larger money picture and the expenditure on folks who are dealing with stress response, with trauma response, that the expenditure of money and time is going to require more than we're currently doing for sure.
And I remember my first year here, spending the first half of the year trying to act like I had it all together and I had all the answers, and hiding behind this sense of confidence that was not there. And finally, halfway through, I just threw my hands up in the air and began to be authentic. And that opened up doors and relationships here that then really changed the rest of my experience here. I found the same to be true as a pastor. It doesn't mean that I walk into a situation with someone who's really hurting and offload my own brokenness, but to be able to share with someone that I have a coach that I meet with every month as a proactive way for me to not get we pray into situations where I need a counselor, but then to be open to counselors and to have those resources as well. And so my coach is someone who holds me accountable to life outside of ministry and all those great things. But to have a sense of authenticity and who we are as pastors in a way that helps shape these opportunities.
I'd like to weigh in real quickly, too, and suggest when I meet with couples that are getting married, I always encourage them to go to a counselor before they get married and do this premarital counseling. There's several reasons to go. It's good for you. It's all this thing. But the biggest reason I tell them that's important is because it demystifies the process of being in counseling. So I would encourage everyone to go to counseling. Once, twice, see how it works, explore what you can get, and openness from the pastor's point of view to say, of course, we honor this tradition and this field, and encourage people to do that.
We're going to wrap up right now, but because we have a class coming in, we want to honor their time and space. But your two best friends, besides fellow clergy in your community, are the funeral home director and mental health care professionals. If you're going through a counseling psychology program, you'd be required to experience counseling yourself. And so why not break the silence, go and experience counseling, and just share what that's like with other students. Go in peace to love and serve. In Christ's name.